Okay, thank you very much, Renisha, and thank you to all the colleagues. Thank you, Inaki. Thank you, Luke, for setting the context, and to everyone involved in organizing this. So, second. Okay. So today, primarily, I won't be talking about why renewables are important for the health system and why it can build resilience, but rather I'd focus more on how you could utilize it and really how you could approach planning and implementing a project from the mere idea of strategizing up until delivering the project or the intervention as a whole. But before we go into the how, I want to just talk about the context in which we're entering for a renewable energy project in a health system. So it's evident that there's huge reliability or there's huge dependency on energy for providing critical health services. And that varies from one part of the health system to another. And so the health system, sometimes it's comprised of health clinics that form the basis of the primary healthcare, and you'd have cold rooms for vaccine and the cold chain equipment, which is also part of the primary healthcare system. And then you'd have hospitals, secondary, tertiary hospitals, other critical facilities. But I want also to add a component within the health system that is sometimes overlooked, which is mobility. All the ones I've previously mentioned are primarily dependent on electricity for provision of services, but mobility in particular is primarily dependent on fuel, really to make its effect. So what I would argue is for us to look at the health system resilience, we'd need first to electrify the health system, provide access to electricity, and then make sure that this source of electricity is a renewable and a sustainable one. But before we go further into the health facility or health infrastructure electrification, I want to emphasize on the idea of energy for mobility in the health system. From a project that we've been working on under the HERS project, or it's called the Health Integrated Resilience System, which is supported by a humanitarian Grand Challenge and Grand Challenge Canada, we've been exploring the viability and the feasibility of replacing internal combustion engine run or regular fuel-dependent vehicles for vaccine transport and for ambulance with alternative electric vehicles. And electric vehicles in this case that are charged potentially in facilities that are also powered by renewable energy. So when you look at the health system, you look at it from a holistic point of view, and you see not only electrification of mobility, but rather electrification from a reliable and a secure source. What we have seen and what we've observed from the pilot that's currently planning and implementing, we've seen that on the longer term, really the electric vehicles are much more competitive. And I'm talking about not few years, but rather of months. Here, you might see the estimate as a bit optimistic for vaccine transport and ambulance of 20 and 15 months. But really, even the conservative estimates of having electric vehicle of $80,000 or $70,000 plus equipment, you'd have a break-even point by months, even like less than 3 years, 2.5 years or 3 years. When considering even like market price fuel of 65, 70 cents per liter for fuel. So what I would argue is for all of us, when we look at a health system electrification, health system resilience, we go beyond the traditional electrification of a particular facility, be it a clinic or a hospital or otherwise. But really, when we look at the current problem, based on the highlight that Luke have provided a very comprehensive overview of, in most cases in most cases where the interventions are taking place, you have no energy access at all, be it in sub-Saharan Africa or certain parts of Asia or elsewhere. But in other places, you might have high dependency on diesel generators that really provide the core electricity supply for a particular region or a particular area. And we'd see that when talking from a humanitarian perspective, you'd see that in Yemen, you'd see that in lots of parts of Syria. You'd see that even in the Gaza Strip, where all the health facilities primarily depend on diesel as the main source because of unavailability of a grid or a grid that is controlled by external stakeholders, instrumentalizing and politicizing it. And in certain cases, you'd have a weak, unreliable grid because of high rationed number of hours or high rationed hours. You might have issues or like natural disasters causing for certain power plants to go off or go out of service, like we've seen in Haiti or Puerto Rico. Therefore, you'd still have certain parts of the grid functional, but you'd have much less number of hours operating. But the solution to all of that in the wide spectrum of problems you'd see in health systems, be it in humanitarian settings or elsewhere, having solar electrification as one of the primary sources of renewable energy and the most prominent and most economically competitive ones as the main primary attraction. And it has been proven that it really achieves economic competitiveness when designed and planned well and when the circumstances allow. It proves that it does not depend on fuel, it's sustainable. So you don't get stuck in a cycle of fuel dependency when fuel is your primary source of energy, especially when it's controlled by external stakeholders, or when you're in a conflict area, fuel being a commodity that powers a local war economy. And finally, the idea of decentralization, localization. Renewables and solar can provide that resiliency against shock of supply of fuel or shock against supply of electricity from the grid. So in its entirety, renewables not only can provide a competitive or economically viable source of electricity, but one that is resilient really and sustainable as it goes ahead. So going further into the how, when you start, the first step we're talking about here is really as a practitioner in the humanitarian setting or in the NGO sector or in the health energy nexus, you'd want to understand what are the applications that are there. Luke, in his presentation, briefly went through the tiers of systems that are there, all the way from like a small system to a kiosk to a mini grid. But here I would just assume that when we're talking about specifically a health facility, we would have those three primary segmentations of systems. One is a conventional off-grid system where it's solar plus batteries, just as a regular one. The most conventional of those are AC systems, and you'd have less common ones as DC systems, primarily one that loads are also DC. In other instances, you'd have a hybrid diesel, PV diesel system with energy storage backup. So that's possibly the case in Inaki's project with MSF in Congo, where you'd have a diesel generator there as backup when fuel is available, of course. But sometimes you depend primarily on the solar plus storage when the solar is sufficient. Here you'd have also two forms of storage. One is a regular approach to sizing, when you might assume 1.5 days or 2 days of load or of consumption demand, or sometimes you'd have more of a lean energy storage approach, where you design for 1 or 2 hours of consumption. And basically, this has been proven more effective in hospitals than elsewhere. And finally, it's the same approach of the second categorization, but when you have a grid as well involved. So when you start planning the project and you start really scoping out what you want to achieve, you determine what is the objective of the project. Are you targeting one particular facility, like one remote facility in the suburbs of Congo, or are you, as UNICEF, for example, targeting all of the cold chain infrastructure in a particular country or region, and therefore you select primary healthcare facilities plus cold rooms, or in some other cases you might target only critical hospitals to ensure that critical hospitals with specific services are secured with reliable source of electricity. Or in third instances, you might have a holistic approach, an integrated approach for the whole system, the whole health system in a particular country or region, where you look at all tiers, primary, secondary, tertiary. You look at hospitals, PHCs, and you look at the cold chain as well. To inform the strategy, we'd want to also understand the local conditions in the country of intervention. Is there an electricity available? Is it does it have a weak, unreliable grid? Is it fuel dependent primarily, so it's all diesel generators, or do you have no access to energy at all? And for example, in certain cases in Darfur or Kurdistan in Sudan or elsewhere. So you'd want, based on the above, you need to determine the plan, the conditions of the country, and what you want to achieve. Do you want to have full electrification and full dependency on the system that you're providing, or you'd want to only provide for critical departments or cold chain, for example? So those three components, or the answers to those questions, inform your assessment plan, assuming that you want really to transition a health system from whatever status it is in to a fully resilient, renewable-based system. So the source, scope of facilities that we've mentioned, the strategy of intervention, the status of the system, informs the assessment plan and its design, and whatever resource mobilization you would do later, and you would implement accordingly. So when we want to go into the second section, which covers the assessment, we'll talk about the assessment process, the planning phase of it, the collection, the tool itself, and how we can analyze. And after that, we can go through the implementation. But for the assessment, when you want to plan it, it's really in threefold. There's the planning of the assessment in itself prior to implementing or collecting the data, and you'd have then the data collection process, and finally the analysis. When planning the assessment, you'd need all of it would be really informed by the strategy and the scope you've answered in the initial phase, and then you'd really start developing the questionnaire and data collection tools accordingly. And from those data collection tools, you'd want to develop a data analysis framework that answers, or you synthesize the collected information into tangible and actionable information. For data collection tools, I would recommend you check out Kobo Toolbox, which is an accessible and free data collection tool. Some other organizations would have their own tools developed, like UNICEF, they have a tool called Data for Action. Other organizations might have their own internal tools developed. When performing the field data collection process, after you've developed the tool and developed the analysis, you'd want to understand that whoever you're collecting the data with are fully oriented with the tool you've developed. You have a clear plan for the collection and the cleaning of the data, for the quality control, which is a huge issue when collecting data. And finally, after completing the data collection process, you'd go into the third phase and of analyzing and synthesizing the data according to a framework. Today, we will expand slightly on. But for the data collection tool, here I provide an example of kind of a tool we use in a primary healthcare approached health system transition. And it covers 5 main elements that are interdisciplinary, not only energy, but also health concerned. So the first one really would understand when you start, the objective of the first section is to understand the categorization of that facility, the points of contact, the geolocations, the coordinates, and latitude, and other general information about it. Then you start collecting health-related information, the services that are provided or services that will be provided in the future, the classification of the facility, because in certain countries they have their own classification. For a primary healthcare facility, they might have A, B, and C, they might have 1, 2, and 3. And according to each of those classifications, they have their own health service package that's offered. You'd want impact and beneficiary statistics for each of those facilities that you are collecting data from. And accordingly, you'd want to categorize them and according to geography and impact. Thirdly, we'd look at spaces that are available to have the solar system installed, that are in areas that are not in non-shaded areas. Structurally, if you're putting it in a building, that the building structural integrity allows for integration of a mounting system and a solar system with its weights. You'd want to understand if there's an electrical room and the distance between the electrical room and the roof space, or the space where you have the solar system. You'd want to quantify the energy demand based on load and based on the source that you have, and the modularization that you could do, and eventually the electricity infrastructure in the region. Quickly, just I know the frameworks might look a bit intimidating, but just to briefly go through this for a PhD example and then for a hospital. It's really good and important to have a plan prior to initiating the assessment, or prior to start collecting the data, a plan framework that is consolidated with the data collection tool that you have in place. So what really are you going to do with the information that you have? For example, here in a PhD setting, all the energy information we've collected, the energy sources, for example, if it's a diesel genset or a grid, etc., I would reconcile it with the load information that we have in terms of the daily energy consumption to determine the daily energy need and the possible energy required. So what is kind of system required based on this energy demand, current and future demand. And then the roof or space information would allow me to know whether I can have solar there in the first place and how much I can put there as a maximum capacity. And thirdly, the health information allow me to classify those systems. When I reconcile all those three pieces of information, I would know then if I can have a solar system that fits in that particular location and whether that location is a priority or not when developing the comprehensive database for the area of intervention. Because you might be assessing 100 facilities or 200 facilities or even 300 or 400 facilities in a particular region. And that's possible, and there's a lot of organizations, including UNICEF and WHO, are doing such assessments of that scale. But I would recommend here, when synthesizing the data, that you do a modular approach for system design, for grouping really and having ranges for each group of consumption, like what we have here, for example. And that's just an example that can difference what can be developed according to the consumption in each particular location. We've developed here 6 modular systems according to range of consumption of 5 kilowatts, 7.5, 10, 12.5, 15, and 20 of solar generation capacity. And based on the consumption, we've started grouping each of the facilities according to that solar system capacity in order to streamline and ease the process for planning and implementation. And as an example of the energy consumption based on load profile, every facility would have its own schedule of the appliances that are there based on them, and the quantity you determine the hours and the load consumption, and eventually the kilowatt hours per day, which is the kilowatt hour is the, for those of you who don't know, this is the energy consumption, the unit of energy measurement that you can quantify the consumption based on it. And this figure really informs the standard approach of how much energy you'd need, and based on it, you'd plan and size accordingly. For hospitals, the story is a bit different. Hospitals are much more complex systems, much more energy intensive. They require much more appliances and much more demand, even in hourly oil consumption. And therefore, the approach for sizing differs a bit. The main characteristics are the same, but 2 things differ here. One is that the energy demand consumption is quantified through a data logger. You'd need to have more accurate forms of data consumption monitoring, and you might have electric devices or electronic devices to quantify the energy consumption based on a particular period. And you might have this for the overall facility, in addition to critical loads, you have a critical section like operation theater, emergency ICU sections, etc. And you'd compare it with the space available. The space available allows you to know, for example, how much you can have of capacity there. And if this is reconciled with how much demand there is, you'd know how much the penetration of that solar system in the mix. And as I mentioned before, you might have it here as a hybrid system with a diesel genset. And critical load, you can determine as well not only a PV diesel system, but if it's a PV diesel system with a critical storage capacity, you'd want to determine what loads would be supplied with critical reliable energy supply when the diesel genset is completely turned off. And first and foremost, obviously, the most important element is energy efficiency as well, which we'll briefly talk about today as well, which is to be integrated prior to designing the eventual system that you are planning to implement. So you've determined the plan, you've designed the tool, you've designed the analysis framework, you've collected the data and you've analyzed. And then you want to build on the results to mobilize resources and plan the implementation. So for the implementation, I'm going to talk about main points briefly, not to go, I might be just going a little bit over time, but just briefly a few points of do's and don'ts for those main phases. Primarily, we'll start with the design and engineering. Options are there for different organizations, both internally, like MSF, where they did the internal design of this as the technical office. Sometimes you'd hire an engineering firm, like a consultancy company, to help you with this. It can be a local company in the area of intervention, depending if the capacity is there, or an international firm. Or sometimes you might want to engage external engineering entities in the area of intervention as well, in addition to whatever internal capacity you might have, like technical NGOs, university research institutions, etc. And the function of the design and engineering phase, or the entity or personnel, is to assess, is to supervise the assessment process, ensure it's validated, especially when there's a distance between, or like a time gap between the assessment itself and the time when you mobilize the resource for implementation. So you need to validate and update the database that you have, and you need to create comprehensive studies for CAD, for lightning protection, for distribution of strings, of layouts, etc. And you'd want to develop the bill of quantities of all the electrical appliances and electrical distribution network you want to have in place. So a few things you need to learn. You need to have engineering personnel engaged as early as possible in the process. When you, as I said, you want to have, when the resource allocation is done, you need to validate whatever you have collected. If there's any updates that were taking place, you want to consider the international markets when developing the specifications. And here we'll go into specific, as the MSF project, they've used lithium, something that's not yet fully conventional, and it's considered to be a bit on the verge because it's expensive, but you need to consider all that is available. You need to prioritize energy efficiency measures before the solar electrification, and you need to consider the critical demands, critical loads in every part of the process. For procurement, and that's a very key and critical aspect that sometimes either makes or breaks a project, and you'd want to consider the options that are available. The first option is one that also MSF pursued in the case study provided by Inaki, is a conventional one where a company that is standard provides the materials and also performs installation services. But the engineering personnel in the organization itself, they develop the specification and they develop the quality control processes. In other parts, and that's sometimes more advantageous, is to segment those processes. You do the procurement yourself as an NGO or a unit agency or development entity for the materials, and you procure them from international markets. And then you might engage local installation companies to do the installation for you. But you need to have in-house capacity for sure, in-house technical and project management capacity to lead such project. And it would be assessed based on the risks available, risks of material delivery, even sometimes of margins if it's too risky and international companies applying, and there's lack of local staff that they determine or they identify, it becomes more expensive. So for materials, it is advisable sometimes to have open international tenders to secure the most competitive prices. Sometimes it's through LTAs, sometimes it's through shortlisted suppliers. Basically, but as we've went through, it's important also engage qualified personnel. Consider, and here I would emphasize on the third point, consider the lifetime costs of the system you're procuring. A very common mistake is that procurement officers or procurement departments only look at the front cost, the upfront cost, and they don't look at the comparison between the different viable options. They look at a lead acid solution and they don't look at a lithium solution, even though if you look at it in a 10-year span, the lithium solution might be much more competitive when compared to the other solution. So in terms of procurement, integrate other unconventional means, not only the upfront costs, long-term costs for the project. And sometimes you can approach from a levelized cost of energy or an LCOE approach. You need to evaluate risks, you need to build on experience and determine the modalities based on all of the above, really, based on the risks and experience and the technology that is. For installation planning, you need to, over time.
We are over time. Could you complete in the next 2 minutes?
Sure, I'll wrap up in 2 minutes. Installation planning, really, you want to consider depending on the size of the project, grouping, clustering facilities according to regions or areas of intervention, standardize as much as possible, look at and consider local codes, local and international codes of design and of implementation, and consider the local considerations and the context. For quality control, you need to engage authorities or relevant stakeholders as soon as possible from early stages in the project. If it's a government, engage the relevant government ministers. If there's no government, engage those managing the health system. Formulate an interdisciplinary supervisory or management committee that combines both people from a technical point of view of health and energy and local authorities. Develop quality control standards early on in the process to ensure that things are thought of and the installation companies have considered all the dynamics. And for sustainability, consider the different options of either going with installation companies or independent company or engaging the local authorities and the technicians at the facility. each option might have its pros and cons, and it might be effective in the different contexts in which it's applied. You also need to plan operation maintenance functions from day one. Ensure quality is there, because one of the biggest sources of failure for renewable energy projects is the lack of a comprehensive operation maintenance strategy, and specifically a lack of financial resources and human capacity for future implications. So ensuring that also financial resources are available in addition to the organizational and human resources, and consider the battery replacement costs in case you're using lead acid, or even in case of lithium, consider the 10-20 years implication. Summary of 7 things to keep in mind in case you were not, you're in a hurry. Plan the comprehensive assessment, prioritize needs. I emphasize prioritize needs where electricity is lacking. Engage qualified engineering personnel as early as possible. Determine best value of money in the procurement and not only the cheapest options. And consider advanced solutions like lithium or PERC modules, etc. And include relevant stakeholders, including authorities, while considering the optimal implementation modalities for the different phases, because it differs from one country to the other. And pursue standards in the installation process in all phases of the project, and plan well for operation maintenance. Thank you for your patience, everyone, and thank you, Renisha. And pardon me for taking a bit. Over to you.